last year, General Milo Zabrowski, Ukraine's hero and winningest general, and I visited Manor College, and were very warmly greeted, and were invited to participate in a future event. Unfortunately, he couldn't make it tonight, but over half of this material is his, and I wanted to make sure I give him credit for it. And I'll explain what elements particularly he stressed. Secondly, last Friday, I gave a speech to the UN at their request on Crimea, and the Russian ambassador, I guess, didn't appreciate it, and was somewhat hostile. And my response is that everyone's entitled to their own opinion, but they're not entitled to their own facts. And so today, I've erred on putting in some slides which actually lay out the maps and details of the military situation in and around Ukraine and some elements of the war. The Russians or others don't like it, then I would encourage them to present their own facts rather than just throw spitballs. We could start with my first slide, Kelly, if you would. Ukraine at war. The next slide, please. Ukraine at war. And with this slide, I think I'm trying to summarize the situation. Ukraine has been victimized by 7 years of war. 13,000 killed, 40,000 seriously wounded, 1.5 million people displaced, over 10,000 homes, businesses, and major infrastructure elements like bridges destroyed. The cost of the war, when I calculated it several years ago, equaled in one entire year of Ukraine's GDP, and today it's higher. And it's a continuing drain on the Ukrainian economy, keeping a large military force on the front line and dealing with increasing Russian belligerence. Both the Russian invasion and occupation of Crimea and led and participated in attacks in the Donbass are a gross violation of international law. It's the first territorial aggression in Europe since the end of World War II, and sets a very terrible example. Agreements signed by Russia that they have now violated include the UN Charter, the Helsinki Act, the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty, the Intermediate Nuclear Forces Treaty, the Conventional Reduction of Forces in Europe Treaty, and, not to be forgotten, the Budapest Memorandum on Security Assurances when Ukraine gave up its possession of nuclear arsenal. Moreover, despite the declaration of a ceasefire, this is not a frozen conflict. This is a bleeding conflict. People are killed every week. Dozens are wounded. And it's not a static situation. There is a growing threat from Russia. There's been a major Russian military buildup against NATO and Ukraine, which I will go into some detail. The Russians are conducting major offensive exercises against NATO, against Ukraine, and interestingly, both at the same time. Russia's destabilized the Black Sea region. Russia is returning to making nuclear threats, both in their exercises and against Ukraine. There's been a Normandy 4 dialogue, but quite frankly, it is a discussion of the deaf and the dumb. The deaf being the Russians refusing to hear any Western comments, and those who would try to speak for Ukraine being very, very weak in their tone. Next slide, Kelly. I got involved in this. The Potomac Foundation had sponsored, at the end of the Cold War, over 1,000 training sessions for East European, former Soviet republics, for their mid-level military officers and diplomats. And we actually had an office at NATO where we would train them. Several of those had been participants came with the new government in Ukraine after the removal of Yanukovych. And they contacted us and asked if we'd run a similar set of training sessions. we were setting that up when all hell broke loose in the invasion of Crimea and then ultimately in the Donbass. And they said if they could bring some of their top people for training sessions, so they asked if we would come and be observers. I wanted to make it a bipartisan effort and also have the expertise of one who knows military issues even deeper than I, and that's General Wesley Clark. I called General Clark, and then, well, it's on our nickel. We'll be paying for it ourselves. Who knows what we'll see, but it shouldn't be boring, and it hasn't been. That was 7 years ago, and we're still at it today. When we were there, General Clark noted that the U.S. Was not aware. The U.S. People were our attachés and our military people were were not being allowed to go to the front, and so it was hard to find out what's happening. Therefore, he said, Phil, I'm going to go see presidents around Europe, General Breedlove, NATO commander, President Obama, all of which he did. He said, but we got to get to the front, so tag you're in. So I spent the next, now total of 32 visits and 108 days in the combat zone, which was next to the birth of my kids and my grandkids, probably the most meaningful element in my life, and being able to witness young Ukrainians willing to sacrifice everything to be a free country. John Clark and I were asked to provide a series of reports to the U.S. Congress. And next slide, Kelly. And go to the next one. And we've been reporting. We've now done probably over 100 reports and given summaries to parliaments and ministries of defense of at least a dozen NATO countries. Next slide. This is not the place to go through a long history, but it's important to kind of note that the Ukrainian and Russian marriage is probably more of a marriage made in hell, has been problematic at best. Starting in 2013, the Russians began pressuring Ukraine, not just about not going to the EU and wanting to join or insisting they join the Russian economic Commonwealth. But there was also active negotiations going on the naval base for Russian naval forces in Sevastopol. The Russians were demanding, being a major recipient of Ukrainian technology, about a third of Russian technology, military technology coming from Ukrainian factories. They wanted control of Ukrainian defense industry. They were also put their own lackeys in, including what turned out to be a Russian minister of defense in Ukraine, and also started making claims about the Russians being abused. When Ukraine became independent, they had inherited an enormous arsenal that had been the Soviet buildup, part of the spending that had bankrupted the Soviet Union. And they had this a huge force, over 700,000 troops on their territory, 6,000 tanks, 1,500 combat aircraft, 350 major ships, and more than 1,200 strategic nuclear weapons that could hit Western Europe and the United States in minutes, plus over 2,500 actually tactical nuclear weapons could be used on the battlefield or in ships or torpedoes or by air. There was an agreement, heavy Western pressure on Ukraine to give those up. And Ukraine didn't want to be a nuclear power, but they were worried about living next door to a nuclear neighbor. So there was a thing called the Budapest Agreement, in which Russia, the US, and Britain all agreed that if Ukraine would give those weapons up, those warheads up, they would not be intimidated with nuclear weapons. They would not have their sovereignty endangered or invaded. Remember that. with that pressure and Yanukovych giving in to the Russian pressure, there was a popular revolt that grew and grew at the Maidan. This is not the place to, again, recall it. But there's a quote that really stuck out to me in early April from a volunteer sitting in a trench who said, "We will stand and fight. We'll die for our own country and new freedom. If the West would just help us, Russia will be deterred and averted." Well, that help, other than words of encouragement, but material help, didn't come. And the war did. 6 days after Yanukovych fled, Kelly, if you'd go to slide 9, please. 6 days after the Yanukovych fled, the Russians launched a clearly and obviously pre-planned and set up invasion. We all laugh now about little green men. But it was interesting how that fiction basically stalled Western reaction, when in fact it was a major military operation that cost 8% of the Ukraine's army, 17% of its air force, a quarter of its air defenses, 50% of its Marine force, 90% of its Navy, and all its coastal defenses. When Ukraine asked for Western help, the response was, we're going to use economic sanctions and encourage the Russians to take an off-ramp. Well, those encouragements have been going on for 7 years. And that off-ramp is nowhere in sight as the Russians race down a military buildup. As I said, my co-author is Major General Mayo Zabrowski. Slide 10, Kelly, gives a summary of this. Interestingly, he was trained at the United States U.S. Army's Command and General Staff College in Leavenworth. He had the most ready unit, even though it only had 2/3 of its manpower, and less than 50% of his equipment could even get out of the door because they'd been so neglected in previous years in defense spending and decisions in the previous government. But his unit was one of the first on the front line in both opposite Crimea, and then did some of the major actions in the Donbass. Later, he was promoted to head of all the Ukrainian volunteer airborne and air assault forces, and since 2019 has become a member of was elected to the Ukrainian parliament by a very high demand. I first met him when his unit, this was in late March of 2014. His unit was covering the causeway to Crimea. And Kelly, if you'll turn to slide 12, I was with him as we walked through the positions and looked through the field glasses, and I can see masses of Russian tanks, artillery, heavy equipment. And I turned to him, and his relatively sparse guys in one row of trenches. I said, "Well, how many tanks do you have?" He said, "Oh, we're assault infantry. We don't have any tanks." And, "Well, yeah, anti-tank weapons?" And he held up a little handheld weapon. I said, "What about artillery?" And he showed me 4 automatic mortars, which are great, but nice system. But he was facing dozens and dozens of heavy Russian artillery and multiple rocket launchers. I turned to him. I said, "How long can you hold this position?" And he gave us a little smile and said, "To the last man." From that moment on, I knew he was really a special person. Next slide, Kelly. In the summer in June and July of 2014, Ukraine was put its forces along the Russian border as they were not only trying to contain, and they freed over half of the land that had been originally seized by not just separatists, but by Russian mercenaries and Russian special forces. But arms were flowing across the border, so they put troops along to try and back up the border guards. The problem is that as Russian equipment and heavy artillery began firing across the border, and the separatists were being reinforced through gaps in the Ukrainian coverage, those troops, over 3,000 of them, were essentially isolated along the border. So And literally within 24 hours, Zabrowski's unit broke through the front, split the Donbass in half, operating as an independent unit, basically no line of supply to the rear, drove deep into the Donbass all the way to the Russian border, and freed and brought back those 3,000 troops. It was the longest and largest armored raid in recorded military history, and a major success. Kelly, if you turn to slide 15. Later that summer, Russia realized that their Donbass adventure was failing, and they launched a direct offensive, not disguised, not little green men, but their most elite troops and heavy armor attacking Ukraine. As they came in the south, where there had not been fighting before and were not separatist positions, they literally overran a series of Ukrainian units and ended up surrounding Ukrainian forces at Ilyevsk, leading to the massacre of many of those volunteers. Ukraine didn't have effective anti-tank weapons that would penetrate the latest Russian armor. And so the front was literally blown open. The Russians were within hours of being able to drive to the Dnieper or to Crimea, cut the country in half. Zabrowski's unit, after his raid had been put in back, was the only unit in reserve. Again, only 2/3 strength. He was reinforced by an additional battalion and told to stop the invasion. I asked him afterward, I said, why did you go on the offensive and why didn't you go into a defensive? He said, I had to cover over 120 kilometers. It was not, I just didn't have enough to defend. I had to knock the attacker off his game plan. I had to hit them and break the momentum of their offensive. And he did. He cut through the invading lines, overran their supplies, overran their command and control. Got down to Mariupol, which was then surrounded, and I know because I was there at the time. Rearmed and refueled, came back up, and then turned east, attacking directly into the Russian forces. He split his force in half, and I remember teasing him because he knows U.S. history, and I go, why did you split your force in half? It reminds me of Custer. It didn't work out so good for him. And he laughed. He said, well, I didn't have a choice. If I stayed as one unit, the Russians would be too easy for them to surround me. So half his force circled one direction, half in another. But his artillery was in the center, so it could support both ways. A brilliant move. The Russians didn't know where he was or how he was going. He hit Russian units from the rear, and they literally jumped out of their tanks with the engines still running and ran. He brought back more Russian equipment, heavy artillery, that he lost in the battle. His exploits are so appreciated, he was brought to the United States multiple times to give lectures to what U.S. Army calls this warrior, annual warrior conference. Several thousand field officers and multiple generals, including several 4-stars. His exploits have been compared by American military general officers as sort of Ukraine's Patton, Ukraine's Rommel, or Israel's Sharon. Zabrowski's not alone, but he's a good example of an entire new generation of young officers who rose to the occasion, threw off the old Soviet attitude about stodgy military, and took the defense of their country with great initiative. Slide 19 shows the evolution of the size of the Ukrainian army. Even though they had a large number of units, they were so poorly manned and equipped that only a fraction of them were actually combat ready, which is the blue line. Today, that has increased by a factor of almost 7. Ukraine has the largest ground force oriented for or in defense of Western Europe, including any and all members of NATO in Europe. The contribution of Ukraine, if you compared it to the last 10 members admitted to NATO, the number of Ukrainian forces, battle-trained, battle-hardened troops, is more than those last 10 members and more ground combat equipment. On the other hand, the Russians have not been sitting still either. If you look at slide 20, during the Cold War, our forces, General Clark will remember this vividly, our forces faced 5 Russian armies: 1st Guards Tank, 2nd Guards Tank, 3rd Shock, 8th Guards Army, and 20th Army. 4 of those armies were disbanded after the end of the Cold War. Well, they're back. 1st Guards Army was reestablished in 2015 and 16, and sitting next to Belarus and Ukraine, and in exercises they practiced making a knife's edge dive to Kyiv. The 20th Army, which was up by Moscow, has been moved down to Voronezh and postured along Ukraine's eastern border. The 8th Guards Army, which had been completely abandoned, has been brought back and is now at Rostov. The 2nd Tank Army, to the east of Moscow, but on the west side of the Urals, is being outfitted with Russia's latest and heaviest tanks and armor and artillery. Russians have also introduced heavy forces into Crimea. Next slide. Russia poses a very severe air threat to Ukraine. If they should take Ukraine, that air force threat would then be even more potent against NATO. There's been a buildup of Russian forces in Crimea. They've added over 20,000 troops, 195 tanks, 410 additional armored vehicles. They've gone from 24 tubes of artillery in Crimea to 283. Combat aircraft from 22 to 100. Not only that, they began bringing back what appears to be nuclear weapons, or at least they are rehabilitating and reestablishing their nuclear storage sites in Crimea. The Russian Navy has actually practiced various blockades across the Black Sea. On a near daily basis, Russian bombers, including nuclear-capable bombers, and strike aircraft, also capable of carrying tactical nuclear weapons, fly the perimeter of the Black Sea. They exercise invasion options against Ukraine, as shown in figure 23. If you take a look at figure 24, the Russians have essentially built a range of options against Ukraine. So in the north, with them now announcing that they're going to be stationing forces in Belarus and aircraft, they can hit Ukraine from the north and almost the rear. 1st Guards Tank Army can come down from the north. What's seen here on the slide is the northern axis. The 20th Army from the eastern axis. The 8th Guards Army and 49th Army from the southern axis. Plus Russian peacekeepers in Transnistria can hit Ukraine from the back, along with amphibious and air assault forces, which are currently in core strength in Crimea, hitting from the south. It's a dangerous situation. My colleague, Dr. Browski, had this quote: Ukraine's destiny should be with the West. If we had modern weapons, Abrams tanks, Bradley infantry fighting vehicles, Apache helicopters, F-16, Patriot air defense, Russia wouldn't bother Ukraine or anyone else in Eastern Europe. But what we need more than any weapon is the knowledge it will not be abandoned. One thing I wanted to stress in this presentation that's an idea of his is asking the United States to bring back the concept of Lend-Lease. Not as a gift, not as, oh, please give a little bit of green nuts for Ukrainians, but as a deal, a shared effort where Ukraine offers the U.S. military bases in Ukraine, which allows us to help defend NATO countries to the north, as well as restabilize the Black Sea in exchange for us helping them with their air defense and particularly their air force. They cannot their Air Force is currently aging. Within several years, the aircraft that they currently have will not be flyable, and they do not have the money to go out and buy new ones. They are literally stuck without help. The Ukrainian army today is very weak without an Air Force covering it and without a modern air defense. But the army itself poses the Russians a real challenge, even if they want to attack NATO. So NATO today has 45 brigades in Central and Eastern Europe, but only a third of them are ready. Ukraine has 22 brigades and 80% of them are ready. Who wouldn't want Ukraine on our side? But they have to be protected in the air and the ground. In conclusion, we use a lot of names: hybrid, conflict, ceasefire, but war by any other name is still war. Ukraine has reformed its military. It now has the strongest land army in Europe, but has no effective navy, an aging air force, and is vulnerable to nuclear threats. Russia's increasing belligerent attitude towards the U.S., NATO, and Ukraine is manifest. Neither Western Europe's dialogue of the deaf and dumb nor more sanctions offer realistic prospect of finding an off-ramp to peace. When people talk about sanctions, that's a good first step. But when it doesn't work, you sit back and say, does threatening to take the lunch money of a bully away from him really stop the bully? No, because bullies and current Russian leadership know only power and force. And when they play in the currency of force, the other currencies are not as persuasive. I encourage the dialogue here and all those listeners with some serious thought to the future.
Okay.
How long can Ukraine hold on? If they fall, what are the implications for NATO and for the U.S.?
Okay, Phil?
U.S. and UK, just ending, will the U.S. and UK meet their obligations under the Budapest Assurance? America recognized the value of Ukraine as a long-term strategic ally and offer military win-wins. Thank you very much. Sorry.
Okay, Phil, thank you very much for that detailed presentation. We ran a little longer than we wanted, but I think we let you do that because you gave a very detailed presentation of the deployment of Russian forces and gives a good indication to our viewing audience of what the Ukrainians and the West are up against. So thank you very much for that.